I didn't notice the strap of my sundress slide off my shoulder until I saw David's eyes. It was the way they lingered, a beat too long, his expression shifting from surprise to something I couldn't quite place. By the time I registered what had happened, it was too late. The thin fabric hung loose, revealing more skin than I ever intended. "David," I stammered, reaching to adjust it. "I didn't hear you knock." His mouth opened, like he was about to speak, but then he closed it, his gaze flicking away, suddenly fascinated by the worn floorboards of my Upper West Side apartment. "I did knock," he said finally, his voice low, steady. "You must not have heard me." I turned back to the antique mirror, fingers clumsy as I tried to secure the strap. My reflection stared back, wide-eyed and flustered, cheeks burning crimson, and it had nothing to do with the summer humidity clinging to the city air. David still hovered in the doorway, hands jammed deep into the pockets of his jeans. "Sorry," he mumbled, clearing his throat. "Didn't mean to interrupt." "It's fine," I said quickly. Too quickly, my voice shaky. It wasn't fine. Not really. Truth was, I'd been miles away, lost in my own head, standing in front of the vanity, brushing my hair with slow, deliberate strokes. It was something I did when the brownstone apartment felt too quiet, when the loneliness crept in, wrapping around me like a threadbare shawl. The apartment had been quiet a lot lately. David had moved back in a few months ago, after college, his plans for grad school indefinitely on hold. I'd welcomed him, of course. He was my stepson, after all. And the place had been unbearably empty since his father, my husband, passed 2 years before. But David's presence had stirred something in me, something unsettling, something I wasn't ready to confront. Something that made moments like this, his unexpected arrival, his lingering gaze, all the more complicated. I turned from the mirror, pulling my silk robe tighter around me. "Did you need something?" I asked, my tone sharper than intended. He flinched, just slightly, but recovered quickly, a faint smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "Just wanted to let you know I'm heading out for the afternoon, meeting some friends downtown." "Oh," I said, my heart still racing. "That's nice?" He nodded, but didn't move, still standing there, his gaze flickering back to me, then away again. "You look nice," he said after a beat, his voice quiet. I froze, unsure if I'd heard him right. "What?" "The dress," he clarified, a faint flush rising on his own cheeks. "It suits you." "Oh," I said again, my fingers twisting in the silk of my robe. "Thank you." He lingered for another moment, his hand resting on the doorframe, before finally stepping back into the hallway. "See you later," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "Later," I echoed, my voice barely a whisper. As his footsteps faded down the hall, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. My hands trembled as I reached for the brush again. My reflection in the mirror was a stranger's face, flushed, nervous, too aware of the man who had just left the room. What was wrong with me? I was 52 years old. I had been a wife, a mother, a stepmother. I knew the rules, the boundaries, the expectations of someone in my position. And yet, in that moment, it all felt fragile, like thin ice. I sank into the chair by the vanity, my hands gripping the edge of the marble tabletop, staring at my reflection. The years had left their mark, of course. Lines around my eyes, a softness where there had once been firmness. But they had also given me something else, a certain kind of confidence, the quiet assurance that came from surviving heartbreak, loss, and the relentless march of time. Or so I thought. But now, with David back in the apartment, that confidence felt like a distant memory. He had a way of looking at me, steady, thoughtful, unflinching, that made me feel exposed in a way I hadn't felt in years. I told myself it was nothing, just a passing moment, a trick of the mind, the product of too many quiet nights and too much time spent alone. But as I sat there, the warmth of his gaze still lingering in my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, and I wasn't sure I was ready for what came next. The afternoon sun slanted through the fire escape window, casting long shadows across the living room as I stood surveying the chaos of tools and lumber scattered across the Persian rug. The old bookcase, a family heirloom, had been threatening to collapse for months, its shelves bowing under the weight of years of collected novels and art books. I'd been meaning to tackle it myself, but lately the motivation seemed to evaporate before I could even start. "Need a hand?" David's voice startled me, pulling me from my thoughts. I turned to see him standing a few feet away, hands shoved into the pockets of his jeans. He'd changed into a plain white t-shirt and work boots, his hair slightly tousled, making him look even younger, less guarded. "I thought you were meeting friends," I said, brushing a stray strand of hair from my face. He shrugged. Plans fell through. Figured I'd stick around and see if you needed help with this. I hesitated, glancing at the disassembled bookcase. The truth was I could use the help, but having him here so close made something flutter uneasily in my chest. It's not exactly thrilling work, I said, trying to sound casual. He smiled, that easy, lopsided grin of his. That's fine. I'm not looking for thrills. Before I could protest, he stepped past me, grabbing a screwdriver from the pile of tools. What's the plan? He asked, his tone light but expectant. I sighed, realizing there was no point in arguing. The top shelf needs support. I was going to reinforce the brackets and maybe replace some of the warped wood. David nodded, already kneeling beside the dismantled bookcase. He moved with a quiet confidence, his muscles flexing under the simple t-shirt as he worked. I watched him for a moment, unable to ignore the way the sunlight caught the line of his jaw, the curve of his shoulders. I shook myself, turning my attention to sorting through the pile of wooden pieces. Careful, I called, as David shifted his weight, the old wood creaking beneath him. He glanced up at me, a teasing smile on his face. Worried about me? Worried about you falling and taking out the good scotch, I shot back, though the warmth in my tone betrayed me. He laughed, a deep, rich sound that made my chest tighten. I'll be fine, he said, brushing a hand across his forehead. For the next hour, we worked in relative silence. The only sounds the rhythmic click of the screwdriver and the occasional rumble of traffic filtering in from the street below. It was steady, satisfying work, and I found myself relaxing into the rhythm of it. Watch out! I called again as David reached for a heavy shelf section, the old wood groaning. He glanced down at me, a playful glint in his eyes. Always looking out for me, aren't you? Someone has to, I retorted, though the words felt softer than intended. He chuckled, that low rumble again, and carefully maneuvered the shelf into place. By the time we finished reinforcing the bookcase, the late afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the room. David stepped back, wiping his hands on his jeans. Not bad for an afternoon's work, he said, stepping back to admire the now sturdy bookcase. I nodded, a small smile tugging at my lips. Not bad at all. He turned to me, his expression softening. You've been doing this kind of stuff all by yourself mostly, right? I admitted, brushing sawdust from my hands. David frowned slightly, his brow furrowing. You shouldn't have to do all this alone. I'm used to it, I said, though the words felt hollow even to my own ears. He stepped closer, his gaze steady. You don't have to be. The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard, and for a moment I didn't know how to respond. Thank you for helping, I said finally, my voice quieter now. He smiled, that same lopsided grin that made something in my chest ache every time. Any time, he said, his tone light but meaningful. As we began gathering the tools and putting them away, the silence between us felt different, not uncomfortable, but charged with an energy I couldn't quite place. When we were finished, David grabbed 2 bottles of water from the small fridge in the corner and handed one to me. Here, he said, his fingers brushing mine as I took it. Thanks, I murmured, my voice barely audible. He leaned against the bookcase, watching me as I took a sip. You work too hard, he said suddenly, his tone thoughtful. I glanced at him, startled by the comment. What do you mean? I mean, you do everything for everyone else, he said, his gaze unwavering. But who's looking out for you? The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswerable. I looked away, focusing on the water bottle in my hands. I'm fine, I said after a moment, though the words felt weak even to my own ears. David didn't respond right away. When I finally looked up, his expression was unreadable, his eyes steady on mine. Well, he said softly, if you ever need someone to look out for you, you know where to find me. The weight of his words settled over me, and I felt my breath catch. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. The sun had nearly disappeared now, the first city lights beginning to flicker on across the darkening skyline. David pushed off the bookcase, stretching his arms over his head. I'm going to grab a shower, he said, his tone casual again. Okay, I said quietly, watching as he headed toward the back of the apartment. When he was gone, I stayed in the living room staring out at the city lights. The tools were put away, the bookcase repaired, but the ache in my chest lingered, an unfamiliar and unsettling weight. I wasn't sure what it meant, but I knew it was something I couldn't ignore. The storm rolled in just after sunset, a slow build of dark clouds that swallowed the last light. By the time the rain began, a steady drumming against the windows, the city outside was nothing but shadows and streaks of neon. I sat curled up on the couch, a warm cashmere blanket draped over my legs, and a glass of red wine in my hand. The living room felt cozier than usual with the storm raging outside. A soft glow from the floor lamp, the faint crackle of vinyl from the old record player spinning a slow jazz tune. It was the kind of night that begged for stillness, for reflection. David walked in, his hair still damp from the shower, dressed in a plain black hoodie and sweatpants. He hesitated in the doorway for a moment as though unsure whether to join me, then stepped inside, carrying his own glass of wine. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, his voice low. I shook my head, gesturing to the other end of the couch. "Of course not." He settled in, stretching his long legs out and leaning back against the cushions. For a while, we sat in comfortable silence, the sound of the rain filling the room, punctuated by the occasional rumble of distant thunder. "I forgot how much I missed this apartment during storm," he said, swirling the wine in his glass. "It does have a way of making you feel tucked away from the world," I said softly. He glanced at me, his eyes catching the warm light from the lamp. "You're good at that, you know," he said. "Good at what?" "Making a place feel like home." The words were simple, but the way he said them, earnestly, without hesitation, made my chest tighten. "Thank you," I said, lowering my gaze to the wine in my hands. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I mean it," he said, his voice quieter now. "When I think about this place, about growing up here, it's not just the apartment I remember, it's you." The warmth in my chest twisted, shifting into something more complicated, an ache I couldn't quite name. "David," I said softly, my voice barely audible. "I'm sorry," he said quickly, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't mean to make it weird." "You didn't," I said, though my heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. He nodded, but his expression remained guarded as though he didn't quite believe me. The tension in the room was subtle but undeniable, a weight that seemed to press against the quiet moments between us. "It's been hard, hasn't it?" he asked suddenly. I looked up at him, startled by the question. "What do you mean?" "Since Dad," he said, his voice soft. "It's been hard for you." I swallowed, the familiar lump rising in my throat at the mention of his father. "It's been an adjustment," I said carefully. "That's putting it lightly," he said, his tone tinged with a faint bitterness. "You've been doing everything on your own. I don't know how you do it." I looked down at my hands, tracing the stem of my glass, the weight of his words settling over me. "You just do what you have to," I said quietly. David shifted closer, his expression earnest. "You shouldn't have to do it all alone." The sincerity in his voice, the way his eyes held mine, it was too much. I looked away, my fingers tightening around the stem of my glass. "I'm fine, David," I said, though the words felt brittle, hollow. "You don't have to be," he said softly. The rain grew louder, a steady rhythm against the windows, and the silence between us stretched out, heavy and unbroken. "You've always been the strong one," he said after a moment, "holding everything together, even when it wasn't fair to you." His words hit harder than I expected, and I felt my breath hitch, the sting of tears threatening at the corners of my eyes. "I didn't have a choice," I whispered. "You did," he said, his voice steady, "but you chose to stay, to care for me, even when I didn't make it easy. I'll never forget that." I looked at him then, the sincerity in his expression cutting through every defense I tried to maintain. He wasn't a boy anymore. He hadn't been for a long time. But in that moment, he looked at me with a depth of understanding that felt far beyond his years. "David," I said softly, my voice trembling, "you don't have to—" "I want to," he interrupted, his tone firm but gentle. "You spent so much time looking out for everyone else. Let someone look out for you for once." The weight of his words, the quiet conviction in his voice made my chest ache. I wanted to say something, to thank him, to brush it off, anything to lighten the moment, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I nodded, blinking back the tears that threatened to spill. "Thank you," I said finally, my voice barely audible. He smiled then, a soft, lopsided smile that made something in my chest tighten. "Anytime," he said. For a while, we sat in silence again, the rain continuing to fall outside. The tension from earlier had softened, but it hadn't disappeared entirely. It lingered, subtle and unspoken, in the quiet way his gaze flickered to me when he thought I wasn't looking, in the way my heart raced whenever his hand brushed against mine as we passed the wine bottle back and forth. By the time the storm began to ease, the room felt warmer somehow, the quiet hum of connection between us impossible to ignore. The rain had stopped by morning, leaving behind a city washed clean. Dew clung to the fire escapes, and the soft gray light of an overcast sky filtered through the windows. The quiet was different now, not heavy, not suffocating, but alive with something unspoken, a tension that hummed beneath the surface of every glance and word. I had spent most of the morning moving through the apartment, trying to busy myself with meaningless tasks, straightening the already tidy bookshelf, wiping down the spotless kitchen counters, folding laundry that was already folded. But no matter how much I tried to focus, my thoughts kept drifting back to last night. David's words lingered in my mind, looping over and over. You don't have to do it all alone. I didn't know what to make of them, or the way he had looked at me, his gaze steady, unwavering, as though he saw something in me that I wasn't ready to face. I was in the tiny laundry closet, folding a pile of fresh towels when I heard his voice. Need a hand with that? I turned to see David leaning against the doorway, his arms crossed over his chest. He was dressed simply in a gray t-shirt and jeans, his hair slightly mussed, as though he'd just rolled out of bed. No, I said, my voice coming out a little sharper than I intended. I've got it. He didn't move, didn't take the hint. Instead, he stepped further into the small space, his expression thoughtful. You've been at it all morning, he said. You should take a break. I'm fine, I said, turning back to the towels. Fine, he repeated, his tone laced with something I couldn't quite place. You always say that. I glanced at him, startled by the edge in his voice. What's that supposed to mean? He shrugged, leaning against the dryer. It means you don't let anyone help you. You act like you've got everything under control, but I can see how tired you are. I opened my mouth to argue, to deny it, but the words caught in my throat. I'm not tired, I said finally, though we both knew it wasn't true. David tilted his head, his gaze searching mine. When's the last time you did something for yourself? Something just because it made you happy? The question caught me off guard, and for a moment, I couldn't answer. I folded the last towel slowly, my fingers brushing over the soft cotton as I tried to think of a response. I don't have time for things like that, I said eventually, my voice quieter now. That's not an answer, he said, his tone gentle but insistent. I turned to him then, the weight of his gaze making my chest tighten. Why does it matter? Because you matter, he said simply. The words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. I felt my breath hitch, my pulse quickening as I looked at him, unsure of what to say. David stepped closer, closing the small distance between us until he was standing just a few feet away. Let me help, he said softly. Just this once. It's just towels, I said weakly, though my voice trembled. It's not about the towels, he said, a small knowing smile tugging at his lips. I turned away, my hands gripping the edge of the counter as I tried to steady myself. The air between us felt charged, the kind of tension that made every breath feel too loud, too heavy. You make everything sound so simple, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. It is, he said, his voice steady. You just have to let it be. I felt his presence behind me, the warmth of him close enough to make my skin prickle. He didn't touch me, didn't move any closer, but the space between us felt impossibly small. David, I said, my voice trembling, this isn't what? He asked, his tone gentle but unyielding. I turned to face him, my breath catching as I met his gaze. The look in his eyes, steady, searching, made my knees feel weak. He wasn't pushing, wasn't demanding, but he wasn't backing down either. It's not easy, I said finally, my voice breaking. I'm not asking for easy, he said. I'm asking for real. His words cut through every excuse, every defense I had tried to build, and I felt the tears prickling at the corners of my eyes. I don't know how to do this, I admitted, my voice barely audible. You don't have to, he said, his hand brushing mine, the touch so light it sent a shiver through me, not alone. The touch lingered just for a moment, but it was enough to unravel me. My fingers trembled as they brushed against his, and I felt the warmth of his skin, the steady strength of his presence. I wanted to pull away, to say something that would break the moment, but I couldn't. Instead, I stood there, frozen, as he took my hand in his thumb tracing gentle circles against my palm. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The quiet hum of the dryer filled the small space, the faint scent of clean linen hanging in the air. When he finally let go, the absence of his touch was almost unbearable. I'll be in the kitchen, he said quietly, his voice soft but firm. If you need anything. He left without another word, and I stood there in the stillness, my heart racing, my mind a whirlwind of emotions I couldn't begin to untangle. The air felt different now, the quiet charged with a new kind of tension, something fragile, something dangerous. And as I stared down at my empty hands, I realized I wasn't sure if I wanted to let it go. The night was unnervingly still, the earlier rain leaving behind a cool, damp hush that settled over the city like a blanket. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the half-empty glass of wine in front of me, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound breaking the silence. Sleep was impossible. The events of the day, the quiet tension that had hung between us, replayed in my mind like a broken record. The way his hand had brushed mine, the way he'd looked at me, as though he could see straight through every wall I'd built. It lingered, relentless and unshakable. And then there was the kiss. I hadn't pulled away. I ran a hand through my hair, sighing deeply, the weight of it all pressing down on me. I told myself it didn't mean anything, that it was just a moment, a fleeting lapse, nothing more. But the ache in my chest told a different story. The creak of a floorboard made me look up sharply. David stood in the doorway, his silhouette outlined by the dim glow of the hallway light. He was barefoot, dressed in a plain black t-shirt and sweatpants, his hair slightly mussed as though he'd been tossing and turning too. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice low. I shook my head, my throat too dry to speak. He stepped into the kitchen, the soft padding of his footsteps on the tile sending a faint shiver down my spine. He poured himself a glass of water and leaned against the counter, watching me carefully. "You've been quiet," he said after a moment. "I've had a lot on my mind," I replied, my voice barely audible. David nodded, setting his glass down on the counter. "Want to talk about it?" "No," I said quickly, the word sharper than I intended. I softened my tone, avoiding his gaze. "It's nothing, I'm fine." That's the second time you've said that today," he said, his voice gentle but insistent, "and I don't believe it." I looked up at him, startled by the directness in his tone. "David, Just tell me," he interrupted, his gaze steady. "What's really going on?" His question hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting, and for a moment I didn't know how to answer. I could feel the tears stinging at the corners of my eyes, the weight of everything I'd been holding back threatening to spill over. "It's complicated," I said finally, my voice trembling. "Then start with something simple," he said, stepping closer, the sincerity in his voice, the quiet patience making my chest tighten. "I don't know where to start," I admitted, my hands twisting together in my lap. David moved to the chair across from me, sitting down and leaning forward, his elbows resting on the table. "Start with what you're feeling," he said softly. I hesitated, the words caught in my throat, but the way he looked at me, steady, unflinching, made it impossible to hide. "I feel lost," I said finally, the admission breaking free in a trembling whisper. David didn't respond right away. He waited, his silence gentle, encouraging me to continue. "I've felt that way for a long time," I said, my voice barely audible. "Since your father passed, since you left for college. This apartment, it's so quiet now. It's like I don't know who I am anymore." I looked down at the table, my hands trembling slightly. "And then you came back," I said, my voice breaking. "And I thought it would help. I thought having someone here would make it easier. But instead..." I trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "Instead what?" he asked gently. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to meet his gaze. Instead, it made me realize how much I've been missing, how much I've been pretending that I'm okay when I'm not. David's expression softened, and he reached across the table, his hand brushing against mine. The touch was light, tentative, but it sent a wave of warmth through me that made my breath catch. "You don't have to pretend with me," he said, his voice steady. I wanted to believe him, but the fear of what it meant, fear of what I was feeling was too strong. "David, this is..." "I know," he said, cutting me off gently. "It's complicated. It's not supposed to happen, but that doesn't make it any less real." His words sent a shiver through me, and I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "I don't know how to do this," I whispered. "You don't have to know," he said softly. "Just let me in. That's all I'm asking." And I felt the tears spill over then, hot and unrelenting, and I buried my face in my hands, unable to hold it back any longer. David's chair scraped softly against the tile as he stood, and then he was beside me, his arms wrapping around me in a warm, steady embrace. For a moment, I resisted, the walls I'd spent years building trembling under the weight of his touch. But then something in me broke, and I leaned into him, my hands clutching the fabric of his shirt as I let myself cry. "It's okay," he murmured, his voice a soothing whisper against my hair. "You don't have to do this alone anymore." The words settled over me, and for the first time in a long time, I let myself believe them. I don't know how long I stayed there, wrapped in his arms, but the warmth of his embrace and the steady rhythm of his breathing soothed something deep inside me. When I finally pulled away, his hands lingered on my shoulders, grounding me in a way I didn't think I needed until that moment. "Thank you," I whispered, wiping at my eyes. David tilted his head, his expression soft but serious. "You don't have to thank me for caring." His words settled over me like a bomb, but they carried a weight I wasn't ready to unpack. I stood, stepping away from him, needing space to gather my thoughts. "I think I should go to bed," I said, my voice shaking slightly. But as I moved toward the doorway, I felt his hand close gently around my wrist. "Wait," he said softly. I froze, my heart pounding. I turned to look at him, and the vulnerability in his eyes stopped me in my tracks. "I need to say this," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "because if I don't, I'll regret it." "David, please, just let me say it," he said, stepping closer, his grip on my wrist loosening but not letting go. The silence between us stretched, heavy and trembling as I nodded, unable to form words. He let out a shaky breath, his hand falling away as he ran his fingers through his hair. I've been trying to ignore this, to pretend it's not there, but I can't. Not anymore. I stared at him, my chest tightening as his words sank in. "I don't know when it started," he continued, his voice trembling, "but somewhere along the way, you became more than just—" He trailed off, his jaw tightening as he struggled to find the words. "More than just what?" I whispered, my voice breaking. He met my gaze, his eyes filled with something raw and unguarded. "More than just my stepmother. You became everything." The air left my lungs in a rush, and I felt as though the floor beneath me had disappeared. "David," I said, my voice trembling, "you can't mean that." "I do," he said, stepping closer, his voice steady now. "I know it's wrong. I know what people would think, but I can't help how I feel." His words left me breathless, my thoughts a chaotic whirlwind of emotions. Fear, longing, guilt, and something I didn't want to name. "This isn't fair," I said, shaking my head. "Not to you, not to me. This isn't right." "Maybe it isn't," he said, his tone soft but unyielding. "But it doesn't change the fact that it's real." He took another step closer, his presence overwhelming, his gaze locking onto mine. "Tell me you don't feel it too," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. I opened my mouth to respond, to deny it, to say anything that would put an end to this, but the words wouldn't come. Because the truth I had been running from was that I did feel it. Every look, every touch, every moment we had shared over the past few months had built into something I couldn't ignore. I closed my eyes, my hands trembling at my sides. "I don't know what to do," I admitted, my voice breaking. "Then don't think," he said, his voice barely audible. "Just let yourself feel." Before I could stop myself, I stepped closer, the space between us disappearing as I let the pull between us take over. His hands cupped my face, his touch gentle, reverent, as though he were afraid I might disappear. And then his lips found mine. The kiss was soft at first, tentative as if he were giving me one last chance to pull away. But I didn't. Instead, I leaned into him, my hands clutching at the front of his shirt as the kiss deepened. It was everything I hadn't known I needed, his warmth, his strength, the way he held me as though I were something precious. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath hitching as his hand slid to my waist, pulling me closer. "David," I whispered against his lips, my voice trembling. He pulled back just enough to meet my gaze, his forehead resting against mine. "Tell me to stop," he said, his voice raw, "and I will." I stared at him, my heart racing, my mind a tangled mess of emotions, but the words wouldn't come. I couldn't tell him to stop. Instead, I kissed him again, the weight of everything we'd been holding back spilling over in a wave of desperate, unrestrained emotion. He lifted me effortlessly, setting me on the edge of the kitchen table, his hands steady as they framed my hips. The feel of his touch, the way he looked at me, it was too much and not enough all at once. His lips trailed from my mouth to my jaw, then down the curve of my neck, and I couldn't suppress the soft gasp that escaped me, my fingers tangling in his hair, holding him close as every nerve in my body seemed to come alive. Time blurred, the lines between right and wrong fading as the moment consumed us. It was raw, unfiltered, and overwhelming. two souls finding solace in each other no matter the cost. When it was over, the room was quiet again, the stillness broken only by the sound of our breathing. David's arms were still wrapped around me, his face buried in the crook of my neck, and I felt a warmth that I hadn't felt in years. But beneath the warmth was a weight, a quiet, unshakable knowledge that nothing would ever be the same. I woke before dawn, the pale light of morning just beginning to seep through the curtains of my bedroom window overlooking Central Park. The apartment was quiet, the kind of stillness that felt both comforting and oppressive. I lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, my body still and my mind racing. The events of the night before played over and over in my head, each memory more vivid than the last. His touch, his words, the way his eyes had searched mine for permission, for something deeper than just the moment itself. It had been years since I'd felt so exposed, so raw. And yet, I hadn't stopped him. And now, the weight of that decision pressed down on me like a tidal wave. I sat up slowly, the cool air brushing against my skin as I pulled the blanket tighter around me. My eyes darted to the kitchen, where it had all happened. The table was exactly as we'd left it, the chair he'd bumped still slightly askew. I couldn't bring myself to touch it, to fix it, as though leaving it untouched might make it less real. The sound of footsteps on the stairs broke the silence. My heart leapt into my throat, my body tensing as David appeared in the doorway. He hesitated when he saw me, his expression carefully neutral, though his eyes held a flicker of something I couldn't quite name. Relief? Regret? "Morning," he said softly, his voice breaking the quiet. "Morning," I replied, my voice barely audible. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He lingered in the doorway, his hands shoved into the pockets of his sweatpants, and I couldn't help but notice the way his hair was still slightly mussed from sleep. "I wasn't sure if you'd still be here," I admitted, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. His brow furrowed slightly, and he stepped closer, his movement slow, careful. "Why wouldn't I be?" I looked down at my hands, twisting the blanket between my fingers. "I don't know," I said quietly. "I just wasn't sure what this morning would feel like." David's silence was heavy, but when I finally looked up, his expression was softer, his eyes steady on mine. "I didn't want to leave you," he said simply. His words made my chest tighten, a mix of relief and something else, something I still didn't want to name. "I don't know what to do, David," I admitted, my voice trembling. "You don't have to know," he said gently, stepping closer. "Not right now." I shook my head, tears stinging at the corners of my eyes. It's not simple. It's not just about what we want." "I know," he said, his tone quiet but firm. "But it's also not just about what other people expect." His words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting, and I felt my resolve wavering. "I'm scared," I whispered, the admission breaking free before I could stop it. David closed the distance between us, his hand brushing against mine as he crouched in front of me. "So am I," he said softly, "but I'm more scared of pretending this doesn't mean anything." I stared at him, my breath catching as his words settled over me. There was no pretense in his expression, no hesitation. He meant every word, and that terrified me more than anything else. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice barely audible. David shook his head, a small, rueful smile tugging at his lips. "I don't know," he admitted, "but whatever it is, we'll figure it out together." The weight of his words, the quiet conviction in his voice made something in me break. I leaned forward, my forehead resting against his, and let out a shaky breath. "I don't know if I can do this," I whispered. "You don't have to decide right now," he said, his hands gently cupping mine. "Just don't shut me out, please." The raw vulnerability in his voice, the way his fingers tightened slightly around mine, was almost too much to bear. I nodded, my tears spilling over as I closed my eyes. "I won't," I promised, though my voice was barely a whisper. Later that morning, after David had gone for a walk in Central Park to clear his head, I sat by the window, staring out at the city. The storm had left everything damp and glistening, the sunlight breaking through the clouds in soft golden rays. The apartment felt different now, quieter, heavier, as though it were holding its breath. I thought about everything that had led to this moment, the years of loneliness, the quiet ache of moving through life without someone to lean on. David's presence had shaken something loose in me, something I'd buried so deeply I hadn't even realized it was there. But what did it mean? What did it say about me that I had let it happen, that I hadn't stopped it when I should have? I ran my fingers along the edge of the table, the same table where everything had changed. My chest ached with the weight of it all. Guilt, fear, longing, and a strange, tentative hope that I didn't know how to hold. Maybe David was right. Maybe I didn't have to have all the answers right now. But one thing was certain. I couldn't keep pretending that nothing had changed, because everything had. As I sat there, watching the sun climb higher in the sky, I let myself take one deep breath. Whatever came next, whatever choices we made, I knew it wouldn't be easy. But for the first time in years, I felt something stir deep inside me.